Hey guys, welcome back to GX Story Sleeping. Tonight we're wandering into the castles and training grounds of medieval Europe to find out why knights, the guys you've probably imagined as unstoppable warriors in shining armor, were often hilariously underprepared for actual combat. Picture yourself as a little noble child in a smoky stone hall, clumsy fingers trying to lace up stiff leather boots, while some grumpy older knight barks orders at you. You're about to start the long journey to knighthood, and, spoiler alert, it's not all epic sword fights and dragon slaying. It's mostly cleaning, carrying things, and wondering why no one's actually teaching you to survive a battlefield. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? What time is it for you? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 7 years old, and instead of learning cool combat moves, you're shipped off to live in another noble household as a page. That sounds grand, right? Except your main job is to run errands, sweep floors, and empty chamber pots. Yes, chamber pots. Turns out, before you can swing a sword, you're supposed to master the fine art of servitude. The idea was that being a page would teach you humility and discipline, but really it just means you're someone's tiny, underpaid butler. There's no real training manual for pages. Every lord has their own way of doing things. Maybe you're lucky and get a household that believes in a little archery, or wrestling on the side. More likely, you'll spend your days memorizing prayers and learning how to curtsy properly at feasts. At night, you roll out a straw mattress and try to sleep despite the constant scurrying of mice and the smell of damp stone. What about actual fighting? Well, occasionally you might get a wooden sword to practice with, but nobody's really coaching you. You swing it wildly in the courtyard, imagining yourself a hero, while older boys snicker at your floppy technique. Historical accounts suggest many pages spent more time learning table manners than combat skills. Some historians debate whether this early stage of training even made sense. Why not teach a 7-year-old to ride and shoot straight away? And let's not forget, nobles were terrified of their kids getting hurt. So anything remotely dangerous, like real swords or serious sparring, was kept off the schedule until later. For now, you're perfecting your handwriting with quills, practicing a bit of lute playing, and hoping the cook doesn't notice you sneaking a hunk of bread. Fun, huh? You thought knighthood meant galloping across fields in gleaming armor. Instead, you're scrubbing armor with vinegar, and wondering how much longer until you get to actually fight something. At 14, you think things are finally about to get exciting. After all, you've graduated from page to squire. A big deal, right? Well, sort of. You do get a sword now, but don't get too thrilled. Most of your time is still spent as a glorified errand boy, this time for a fully fledged knight who treats you like a pack mule in chainmail. Your daily routine isn't filled with heroic duels. Instead, it's full of tending to your master's horse, polishing his boots until you can see your own tired face reflected in them, and running back and forth to fetch his wine at feasts. If you're unlucky, you'll even be the one helping him put on his armor piece by piece. A sweaty, back-breaking process that takes forever. Yes, you're the medieval version of an unpaid intern. There are moments where you get a taste of combat. You might spar with blunt swords or practice riding a horse while balancing a heavy shield, but these are inconsistent at best. There's no set curriculum for squires across Europe. Some lords drill their boys hard, while others barely bother, assuming you'll figure it out when the time comes. Modern historians often argue over how much practical training squires actually got. Some think many of them were woefully underprepared for real warfare. And then there's your master's priorities. Instead of giving you battlefield wisdom, he spends hours bragging about his jousting victories from decades ago. He's obsessed with tournaments, flashy, staged affairs designed more for entertainment than practical combat. He pushes you to practice fancy maneuvers with a lance, but only so he can show you off at the next local fair. Real war tactics? Not a priority. When he's not boasting, he's lecturing you about courtly love. Apparently, writing a decent love poem for a noble lady is just as important as knowing how to survive an ambush. You do your best to look interested, but deep down you're wondering if you'll ever learn how to block an actual sword strike. At night, your arms ache from holding heavy shields all day. You smell like horse sweat and feel like a walking bruise. And yet, in your heart, you're still convinced this is all building up to something grand. that one day soon you'll transform into the perfect warrior. But for now, you're more familiar with saddle sores than swordplay. You've been at this for a couple of years now, and surely, there must be a real training program about to kick in, right? Except there isn't. There's no standardized curriculum for knights in medieval Europe. In fact, your so-called education depends almost entirely on who your knightmaster happens to be. Some treat their squires like apprentices and drill them daily in swordplay and horsemanship. Others, they're too busy drinking mead and bragging about the old crusades to bother with teaching anything at all. If you're unlucky, and let's face it, you probably are, your training is little more than jousting practice against a wooden quintain. The quintain is a spinning target with a shield on one side and a weighted arm on the other. You charge it with your lance, trying to hit the shield without getting smacked in the back of the head by the counterweight. Fun, yes, but this doesn't prepare you for the chaos of real combat. In a real fight, enemies don't stand still and politely wait their turn. When the knight does give you pointers, they're vague at best. Keep your blade up, don't get killed. Remember, God is on your side. That's about as helpful as being told to just swim while you're drowning. Scholars today debate whether this lack of structure was intentional. Maybe the nobility wanted to preserve the mystique of knighthood, or if it was plain negligence. Every now and then, you're allowed to spar with other squires. These sessions usually devolve into clumsy flailing matches, with wooden swords flying out of sweaty hands, and squires limping off to the healer with bruised ribs. There's no real technique being taught, just swing hard and hope for the best. Meanwhile, your knight is off hunting boar or discussing politics at court. And let's not even get started on your armor. You've been given a mail shirt that weighs nearly as much as you do, and no one has shown you how to move properly in it. Instead of lunging gracefully like you imagined, you waddle around the practice yard like an overstuffed duck. Every night, you collapse onto your straw pallet with sore muscles and an uneasy feeling. You're 3 years into squirehood, and it's dawning on you that there's no grand secret to becoming a knight. If you survive this training at all, it'll be sheer dumb luck. You've been at this for a couple of years now, and surely, there must be a real training program about to kick in, right? Except there isn't. Instead, your education depends entirely on which knight or household you're attached to. One squire might spend his days practicing horseback charges and sword strikes, while another is stuck endlessly jousting at a wooden post that does nothing but spin around and occasionally smack him in the head. Welcome to the great medieval lottery of knightly training. There's no central authority handing out lesson plans, no official book titled How Not to Die as a Knight. Instead, each nobleman believes he knows best. Some focus heavily on hunting and hawking, convinced that if you can chase down a stag in a forest, you can probably handle a battlefield. Others emphasize dancing and etiquette over combat, as though twirling gracefully in a candlelit hall will save you when arrows start flying. You're lucky enough to get the spinning quintain, the contraption with a shield on one end and a sandbag on the other. Hit it wrong, and the bag swings around and whacks you in the ribs. At least it's a step up from polishing boots. But no one is explaining actual combat tactics here. You learn by trial and error, which is fine until trial leads to bruises, and error means being thrown from your horse into a puddle. Then there's the question of archery. You've noticed the common boys outside the manor practicing with longbows, their arrows thudding into straw targets. You envy their skill, but as a noble, you are forbidden from touching such peasant weapons. The longbow is considered too lowly for you. Historians still debate whether this ban made sense. Sure, the weapon was simple, but it was devastatingly effective in battle. Meanwhile, you're stuck with a sword that feels too heavy, and a lance that wobbles in your grip. To make matters worse, your knightmaster is obsessed with chivalry. Not the useful kind, more like endless speeches about honor, loyalty, and protecting fair maidens. You can recite these virtues in your sleep now, but when it comes to actual fighting, you're still wildly unprepared. Occasionally, you wonder if he even remembers what a real battle is like. Some evenings, as you nurse yet another sore shoulder from practice, you lie on your straw pallet staring at the rafters. What if war comes tomorrow? Would you actually be ready? One chilly morning, you're summoned to the armory and handed a sword that costs more than most peasants will earn in their entire lives. Its hilt is gilded, the blade gleams in the dim light, and it feels absurdly heavy in your hands. You half expect someone to give you detailed instructions on how to wield it, but no. Your Knightmaster simply pats you on the shoulder and mutters something vague like, "You'll get the hang of it." That's it. No diagrams, no drills, no long lectures on grip, stance, or timing. Just you, a hunk of expensive steel, and the terrifying realization that you have no idea what to do if someone swings back at you. You're starting to understand why so many young knights freeze up in their first skirmish, and why there are stories of men dropping swords into the mud during battle. You try practicing on your own. Swing, step, thrust. But the blade feels awkward, like an unruly extension of your arm. After a few minutes, your muscles ache, and your palms are blistered. You glance over at the peasants training with simple farming tools in the fields. They seem far more confident with their makeshift weapons than you are with your prize blade. There's also the issue of armor. It's not like modern sports gear with clear instructions and proper fitting. Your chainmail shirt sags heavily over your shoulders, and no one has taught you how to move fluidly in it. Your helmet is so tight, it presses your ears flat, making every clang echo painfully in your skull. At least one historian suggests that many knights in this period trained less in full gear than we like to imagine. Some never wore it at all until their first campaign, which explains why they often stumbled around like clumsy tin cans. And let's not forget maintenance. Your master insists you learn to polish your sword and oil your armor, but there's no guidance on keeping your muscles strong enough to carry the stuff in the first place. The result? You end up like many of your peers, physically weak under all that expensive equipment, with just enough knowledge to look impressive, but not enough to stay alive in real combat. It's a strange paradox. The higher your status, the less practical training you seem to get. And that realization is starting to sink in every time you pick up this beautiful, useless sword. You're up at dawn one morning, rubbing sleep from your eyes as you hear the unmistakable thunk-thunk of arrows hitting targets outside. Curious, you wander over to see a group of village boys practicing with longbows, their movements fluid, their shots frighteningly precise. For a moment, you imagine joining them, learning how to draw that elegant curve, loosing an arrow straight into a bullseye. But then you remember, as a noble, you're forbidden to touch a longbow. The weapon of the peasantry is considered too crude for someone of your status. You're meant to wield a sword, ride a horse, and fight face to face with honor. Archery is for commoners. And so, while those barefoot boys are quietly perfecting the art of raining death from a distance, you're stuck practicing your dueling posture in front of a mirror. It doesn't seem like a big deal now, but deep down, you suspect this rule will come back to bite you. Historians still debate whether these class-based weapon bans helped maintain chivalric ideals, or just left noble warriors utterly vulnerable to massed archery on the battlefield. After all, it's hard to maintain your dignity when you're being peppered with arrows from 200 yards away. Even when you're offered ranged weapons, they're laughably impractical. Crossbows are so slow to reload, you'd better hope no one charges at you while you're cranking the mechanism. Throwing spears is considered more of a sport than a survival skill, and nobody really explains the physics of aiming. You're supposed to figure it out as you go. Meanwhile, your Knightmaster spends hours lecturing you about the importance of honor and face-to-face combat. A true knight doesn't hide behind a bow, he says, thumping his chest proudly. But isn't surviving also part of being a true knight? You want to ask, but you bite your tongue. On nights when you can't sleep, you replay what you saw in the village. Boys firing arrow after arrow, their accuracy frightening. You picture yourself facing them in battle one day, your shiny armor no match for a storm of wooden shafts. And for the first time, a cold unease creeps into your stomach. Maybe you're not being trained for the world as it really is. It's a warm spring morning, and you're finally feeling optimistic. Today might be the day your Knightmaster teaches you a cunning battlefield maneuver or drills you in the art of the shield wall. But instead, he's dragging you halfway across the countryside to visit yet another monastery. Why? To see a holy relic. You trudge behind him, your boots caked in mud, trying to figure out how staring at a dusty bone fragment or a splinter from the true cross will help you in combat. He's convinced that these sacred objects will grant him divine favor on the battlefield. You, on the other hand, suspect they'll just give you allergies. When you finally arrive, the relic is displayed with all the ceremony of a royal feast. Monks chant, candles flicker, your master kneels reverently, eyes closed, muttering prayers. Meanwhile, you shift your weight from foot to foot, wondering if this is really what knightly training is supposed to look like. Historical records show this wasn't unusual. Many knights believed that relics and prayers could protect them better than any swordsmanship. Some even carried tiny bone shards into battle as charms, trusting in miracles over muscle memory. While your master's faith is touching, it's also distracting. Instead of teaching you how to handle a sword properly, he's telling you stories about saints and their martyrdoms. Once, after a long sermon on St. George, he handed you a lance and said, "Have faith, and it will strike true." That's his version of combat advice. You tried not to roll your eyes. Faith might be comforting, but you can't help noticing how the peasants outside the monastery are practicing with slings and staves, while you're kneeling on cold stone floors. There's even a heated debate among modern historians about whether this focus on piety dulled the practical edge of knights. On the way home, your master insists on stopping to collect blessed water from a roadside shrine. You're carrying the heavy jug, shoulders aching, when you realize you've spent an entire day without touching a weapon. The battlefield feels a million miles away. That night, you lie awake, staring at the rafters, a thought gnawing at you. If relics really worked, why would knights need armor at all? You're jolted awake before dawn by your master bellowing, "Time for mounted drills." Finally, you think, a chance to learn real horseback combat. The thought of thundering across a field, lance steady, like the knights in tapestries, makes your heart race. But reality? Not so majestic. For starters, the warhorse you're assigned isn't the noble destrier you dreamed of. It's a half-trained, irritable beast with a tendency to veer left at the worst moments. The saddle creaks under you as you struggle to stay balanced, and your thighs already feel like they're on fire from gripping so hard. Mounted combat is supposed to be the crowning skill of any knight, but nobody's teaching you the finer points. Your master assumes you'll get a feel for it. So you end up wobbling in your saddle as he shouts generic advice like, "Keep your lance straight," or "Don't fall off." Helpful. When he demonstrates a charge, it's impressive, until you realize his horse has been carefully trained for years to tolerate the chaos of battle. Yours, on the other hand, panics at the sound of clanking armor and tries to bolt whenever you lower your lance. One bad turn and you're tumbling into the mud. You hear stories of squires breaking ribs, collarbones, even necks in these early attempts at mounted drills. And no wonder. Real war horses were expensive and scarce, so most trainees practiced on smaller, less disciplined animals. Some scholars argue that this lack of access to quality horses left generations of knights underprepared for mounted combat. Even basic tasks like drawing a sword while riding turn out to be harder than you imagined. The blade catches awkwardly on your scabbard, and when you finally manage to swing, you almost lose your balance. You start to understand why so many knights preferred to fight on foot once they'd been unhorsed. At least then, you didn't risk breaking your neck. By the end of the day, you're soaked in sweat, covered in bruises, and seriously questioning whether humans were meant to fight from horseback at all. As you limp back to the stables, your master praises your progress. You're too tired to point out that your horse is the one making most of the decisions out there. It's another dreary morning in the practice yard, and today you're struggling to even lift your chainmail shirt over your head. It's damp from last night's rain, smells faintly of mildew, and weighs so much you feel like you're about to sink straight into the earth. By the time you've wriggled into it and tugged your patagambeson tight, your arms are already aching. No one warned you how physically demanding armor really is. They told you it would make you invincible, but what they didn't say is how quickly it saps your strength. Every movement feels like wading through thick mud. You try raising your sword and find that your muscles are shaking almost immediately. Clearly, all those years fetching wine jugs and polishing boots didn't prepare you for carrying 50 pounds of iron around all day. And the maintenance is relentless. The mail is already sprouting tiny patches of rust because you weren't taught how to oil it properly. Your master just handed you a bucket of vinegar and some rags and said, "Make it shine." You can't help but think that a rusty ring or two could make all the difference if an enemy blade catches you there. In theory, knights are supposed to train in armor regularly to build endurance, but that's more ideal than reality. Many squires and even seasoned knights avoid donning full gear unless absolutely necessary. Scholars debate whether this was laziness or practicality. Why ruin your expensive armor sweating in a muddy yard when you could save it for tournaments and war? Speaking of tournaments, that's where most of your practice time goes these days. You've gotten decent at parading around in lighter ceremonial armor during jousts, but it's a far cry from the brutal crush of real combat. Tournament fighting isn't about killing, it's about looking impressive for the crowd. And while you're perfecting your dramatic flourishes and flashy lance techniques, your real-world battlefield skills aren't improving much at all. By the afternoon, your legs feel like lead, your arms are noodles, and your back aches from carrying all that weight. And this was just practice. Imagine doing it for hours on end, with arrows flying and swords clashing all around. As you collapse onto a bench, you realize that while your armor might look heroic, it's also a personal prison of iron links and sweat. You're back in the practice yard again, but today feels different. Instead of the usual half-hearted drills, your Knightmaster has you preparing for an upcoming tournament. At first, you're excited. This is your chance to prove yourself in front of nobles and ladies, to finally show off all those years of hard work. But as the day wears on, it becomes painfully clear that this isn't real combat training. Tournaments are all about spectacle. You're taught how to angle your lance just right, so the tip glances off your opponent's shield for a dramatic spray of splinters. You practice bowing in the saddle with flourish, and even rehearse falling in a way that looks heroic instead of humiliating. Your knight keeps drilling into you that honor in the lists is paramount. It's not about winning. It's about winning gracefully, he says, adjusting the plume on your helmet. Meanwhile, any focus on actual warfare, dirty, chaotic, and merciless, is shoved aside. And there's a downside to all this pageantry. Knights who spend too much time in tournaments tend to develop bad habits for real combat. You notice yourself favoring wide, sweeping strikes that look impressive to spectators, but leave you horribly exposed. There's even a debate among modern historians about whether tournaments made knights more effective or simply turned them into showmen. As the tournament approaches, you are fitted for a lighter, polished suit of plate armor designed to gleam in the sunlight. It's beautiful, but flimsy compared to the rugged gear you'd need on campaign. Your horse, too, is trained to prance and sidestep elegantly instead of charging into enemy lines. On tournament day, the air is thick with dust and excitement. Trumpets blare, banners ripple, and the crowd cheers as you ride into the lists. You manage to stay on your horse during your first tilt, earning polite applause. But deep down, you can't shake the thought, this is all a game. There are no screaming enemies here, no arrows whistling past your ear, no mud sucking at your boots as you try to stand. That night, while polishing your dented shield, you wonder how many of these beautifully armored knights would freeze in terror the moment they saw a real battlefield. You're back in the practice yard again, but today feels different. Instead of the usual half-hearted drills, your Knightmaster has you preparing for an upcoming tournament. At first you're excited. Finally, a chance to prove yourself. You imagine yourself galloping across the tilt yard, lance aimed perfectly. The crowd cheering as you unhorse your opponent in one clean strike. But the reality? Tournaments aren't about battlefield survival. They're about putting on a show. Your master spends hours fussing over your surcoat's colors and your family crest, making sure you'll look the part. As for combat training, it's all centered on jousting. Ride straight, aim your lance, hit the shield squarely. Over and over again, you repeat the same maneuver until your wrist aches and your horse is ready to bolt from boredom. Sure, jousting teaches you balance and timing, but it's hardly preparation for the chaos of actual warfare. On a real battlefield, nobody's charging at you one at a time while a herald blows a trumpet. You'll be surrounded, confused, and likely knocked off your horse in seconds. Modern historians argue that this obsession with tournaments created a generation of knights who excelled in showy duels but floundered in real combat. And tournaments aren't just risky, they're political. A single mistake, like knocking the wrong nobleman off his horse, could spark a feud between families. Your master warns you to pull your blows if you face someone important. So now, instead of focusing on fighting, you're worried about offending the wrong person and starting a blood feud over a bruised ego. The rest of your training mirrors this misplaced priority. Instead of learning how to coordinate with infantry or defend against archers, you're practicing elaborate flourishes with your sword to impress spectators. It's style over substance, and deep down, you know it. By evening, as you rub ointment into the raw patch where your armor rubbed your collarbone raw, you can't help thinking, what's the point of all this pageantry if it doesn't actually keep you alive in war? You glance over at your Knightmaster polishing his gilded tournament helm. and you can't shake the uneasy feeling that you're being prepared more for applause than for survival. It's a rainy afternoon, and you're slumped over a table with a quill in hand, trying to scratch out a flowery poem to impress some noblewoman you've never met. Your Knightmaster insists this is just as vital as swordsmanship. A true knight must have a refined soul, he says, wagging a finger. You'd rather refine your sword swing, but here you are, debating whether "my lady's eyes are like stars" is too cliché. This is the paradox of knightly training. While you can barely hold your own in a sparring match, you're expected to compose elaborate verses, memorize courtly dances, and bow at the perfect angle. Reading and writing? Optional for some knights, but you're expected to dabble in them so you can exchange love letters and oaths of loyalty. You know more about rhyming couplets than battle formations. It's not that literacy is widespread either. Many knights couldn't read at all, relying on priests or scribes to handle their correspondence. Some historians argue this lack of education made knights tactically weak, unable to study military manuals or maps properly. But others claim literacy was considered a distraction from true knightly virtues like courage and faith. Meanwhile, your ego is growing faster than your skill set. You strut around in your surcoat, practicing compliments and imagining yourself the ideal chivalrous hero. You've noticed that many squires and young knights fall into this trap, more concerned with impressing the court than mastering their weapons. It doesn't help that the older knights encourage this vanity, telling tales of their own glorious deeds that sound increasingly suspect the more you think about them. By nightfall, you're still staring at your unfinished poem, quill dangling limply in your fingers. Outside, the castle guard drills with their spears, their movements sharp and purposeful. You can't help but wonder if they're more prepared for real combat than you are. But hey, at least your couplets are coming along nicely. The hall smells of roasted boar and spiced wine, and your master is already several goblets deep, laughing so loudly the rafters tremble. You're perched awkwardly at the edge of the table, sipping weak ale, and wondering if you'll even wake up early enough for training tomorrow. Spoiler, you won't. Feasting is a central part of knightly life, or so your master claims. But between the endless courses of greasy meat and the rivers of alcohol, it's starting to feel less like tradition, and more like an excuse for everyone to get spectacularly drunk. You watch as a fellow squire staggers out of the hall, clutching his stomach, while a knight recites a bawdy poem about honor that's making the ladies titter behind their fans. At first, these banquets seem like a reward for all your hard work, but they quickly become a routine. Late nights and heavy drinking are wrecking your mornings. Your head throbs, your body feels sluggish, and when you do manage to stumble into the yard, your footwork is sloppy. Any dreams of crisp dawn training sessions vanish under layers of fatigue and wine hangovers. You're not alone in this. Many knights of the period indulged heavily, convinced that a hearty appetite and love of drink were signs of a robust warrior spirit. Some historians argue this culture of excess was partially to blame for poor discipline among the nobility. After all, it's hard to swing a sword properly when you're still tasting last night's venison stew in your throat. When you try to excuse yourself from a feast, your master gives you a withering look. A knight must endure discomfort, he says, slapping your back so hard you nearly faceplant into your trencher. Apparently, enduring hangovers counts as chivalric toughness now. By the end of the week, your body feels heavier than your armor, and your reflexes are dulled. As you flop onto your straw pallet, you can't help but think, maybe knights aren't supposed to be this soft, but nobody seems in a rush to change things. You're in the yard again, staring at a group of grizzled foot soldiers practicing with spears and shields. Their movements are precise, their teamwork fluid. You watch as they drill relentlessly, adjusting their formation with a single shouted command. It's impressive and humbling. Your Knightmaster, however, barely spares them a glance. "Don't waste your time watching peasants," he scoffs. A true knight fights with honor, not in a rabble. But deep down you suspect those peasants could teach you more about staying alive in battle than all the poetry lessons and jousting tournaments combined. The truth is, knights rarely trained with common soldiers. Noble pride kept them separate. You're taught to look down on infantry, assuming their skills are crude and unworthy of your attention. Yet these men have survived skirmishes and border raids, while many young knights, overconfident and underprepared, never even make it through their first campaign. Historians still debate whether this arrogance contributed to the downfall of many knightly orders. On the rare occasions when knights did try to coordinate with foot soldiers, it often ended in disaster. Miscommunication, clashing egos, and disdain for lesser men created chaos on the battlefield. But in the practice yard, you start to wonder, could you even hold your own in a fight against these seasoned veterans? You approach one of the soldiers during a water break, asking if he might teach you a few spear techniques. He grins, amused, but before he can answer, your master swoops in like a hawk. "Don't lower yourself to their level," he says sharply. A knight leads. He does not follow. And so, you step back, humiliated. But as you watch the infantry resume their drills, something nags at you. Maybe, just maybe, their lowly skills are exactly what you're missing. You're in the yard again, staring at a group of grizzled foot soldiers practicing with spears and shields. Their movements are sharp and coordinated, each man adjusting instinctively to the others. You can't help but notice how efficient they look, how grounded their training seems compared to your own. For a moment, you're tempted to wander over and ask them to show you a thing or two. But then you remember your place. You're a noble, destined to fight on horseback with sword and lance. Mixing with common infantry is frowned upon. Beneath your dignity, they say. And so you stay where you are, awkwardly swinging your sword at a practice post while they exchange knowing glances. This division between knights and peasants isn't just social, it's tactical. Many knights refuse to train alongside their foot soldiers, convinced their superior birth and flashy weapons will carry them through battle. But historians argue this was a critical flaw. Infantry veterans often knew far more about real combat than young knights did, yet pride kept the classes apart. It doesn't help that your knightmaster dismisses the peasants as cannon fodder. He sees no reason for you to dirty your hands learning their techniques. When you suggest practicing a spear wall or trying out a bow, he laughs. Leave that to the rabble. A knight fights with honor, not like a farmhand. But the truth is, you're starting to wonder if the rabble are onto something. They're tough from years of hard labor, their muscles lean and wiry. You, on the other hand, are still struggling to keep your sword arm steady after 10 minutes of drills. One evening, you overhear two soldiers talking about how they once held off a mounted charge using sharpened stakes and teamwork. The image lingers in your mind, rows of peasants toppling proud knights like sacks of grain. You realize, with a sinking feeling, that in a real fight, your training might not be enough to save you, and yet, you can't bring yourself to ask for their help. The gap between you and them feels like a stone wall, reinforced by centuries of tradition and arrogance. So, you keep to your own little corner of the yard, practicing moves that look good, but feel hollow. The sun is high overhead, and you're meant to be practicing sword drills in the courtyard. Instead, you're kneeling before a chapel altar, while your knightmaster murmurs a long-winded prayer. He insists that your faith is the greatest weapon you'll ever wield. If God favors you, he says, no blade can pierce your armor. At first, this sounds comforting. You like the idea of divine protection, of angels swooping down to deflect arrows and smite your enemies. But as the weeks go on, you notice how often faith is used as an excuse to skip practical training. One afternoon, when you suggest sparring in full armor, your master waves it off. Why toil in the yard when we can seek God's blessing? Prayer will strengthen your arm better than sweat ever could. You're not the only one worried about this mindset. Some chroniclers of the time hint that knights relied too heavily on religious rituals instead of real preparation. They wore crosses into battle, hung relics around their necks, and assumed their noble birth gave them an edge. But no amount of praying can teach you how to counter a spear thrust or parry a fast-moving blade. There's even talk among scholars today about divine fatalism, a belief that God had already decided who lived and died in battle. Why train hard if your fate was sealed anyway? Your knightmaster embodies this attitude perfectly. He spends more time at the monastery than on horseback, and you're starting to feel like you're in a seminary, not a military academy. Still, you play along. You kneel, you recite the prayers, you splash holy water on your sword before sparring. But deep down, unease gnaws at you. When real combat comes, will divine favor be enough? Or will your lack of actual skill leave you bleeding in the mud, staring up at an indifferent sky? The thought haunts you as you shuffle out of the chapel, sword hanging limply at your side. The day of your first real battle arrives, and the air is thick with the metallic tang of fear. You can hear the distant clash of weapons and the shouts of men already locked in combat. Your heart hammers in your chest as you try to recall all the drills, prayers, and tournament flourishes you've practiced over the years. Your horse shifts nervously beneath you, sensing your tension. You tighten your grip on the reins, but your fingers are slippery with sweat inside your gauntlets. Your Knightmaster rides past, shouting encouragements about honor and glory, but his words feel hollow now. As the enemy comes into view, a wave of panic crashes over you. They're not like the polite tournament opponents you're used to. These are hardened soldiers with scarred faces and ragged armor, moving with purpose and coordination. Arrows hiss through the air, and you duck instinctively, heart pounding in your ears. When the charge begins, your horse surges forward, and for a brief, glorious moment, you feel like the knights in the stories. Unstoppable, invincible. But then chaos erupts. An arrow slams into the man beside you, sending him tumbling from his horse. A spear flashes up from the enemy lines, and your horse rears violently. You lose your grip on your sword. It falls with a dull thud into the mud below, just as your horse panics and throws you. The world spins as you hit the ground hard, the weight of your armor knocking the wind out of you. Gasping, you fumble for your blade, but your fingers feel like lead. Around you, the battle rages on. Foot soldiers swarm, axes biting into armor, shields splintering. You're paralyzed, stuck between the instinct to flee and the crushing weight of fear. All the training, prayers, and feasts have not prepared you for this moment. Modern historians sometimes call this battlefield panic, a phenomenon where inexperienced knights froze under the sheer sensory overload of war. You're living proof of it now. As you scramble to your feet, you wonder how many other knights in your position are discovering, too late, that they were never truly ready. The sounds of battle are fading now, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the cawing of crows overhead. You're sitting in the mud, helmet off, staring blankly at the dented sword lying across your knees. Somehow, you survived, though you're not sure how. Around you, the field is littered with the fallen. Noble knights in gleaming armor lying side by side with peasant foot soldiers. You remember how confident you felt riding out this morning, convinced that chivalry and faith would see you through. Now you realize how fragile that illusion was. You glance at the surviving infantrymen as they move quietly among the bodies, gathering weapons and tending to their wounded. These are the same men your Knightmaster dismissed as lesser warriors, yet they fought with a level of discipline and grit you never learned. It's dawning on you that their training, simple, practical, and often brutal, was far more effective than the years you spent polishing armor and composing poetry. There's a heavy debate among historians about whether knights' emphasis on honor and spectacle ultimately made them poor soldiers. Some argue it bred overconfidence, others say it blinded them to the evolving realities of warfare. Looking down at your trembling hands, you suspect both are true. You stagger to your feet, every muscle aching under the weight of your armor. For the first time, you feel its bulk not as protection, but as a prison. The shiny plates that impressed the crowd at tournaments couldn't stop the raw chaos of combat. As you limp toward the safety of the rear lines, you vow that if you survive another day, you'll train differently, practically. But in the back of your mind, you can't help but wonder, is it already too late? Now, let's slow everything down for the final 200-word wind down. The battlefield fades from view, and your breathing begins to settle. The clatter of armor, the shouts of men, and the thud of hooves all dissolve into a distant hum, like rain tapping softly on a roof far away. You find yourself standing in a quiet field at dusk, the sky streaked with soft gold and violet, a gentle breeze brushing your face. You're safe now. No more drills, no more heavy armor, no more shouting masters telling you to hold your lance higher. Just the sound of crickets in the grass and the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat. Feel how your body relaxes, the tension draining from your shoulders and arms. The weight of the day slips away, leaving only calm and quiet. The air smells fresh, clean, as though the whole world has been washed in a summer rain. You let your eyes drift shut, and in the darkness behind your eyelids, imagine yourself finally free from the clumsy training and chaos of battle. Just you, a soft breeze, and the soothing promise of sleep. Take a slow breath in and out. You're ready to rest now.